Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. Well, New York, Cleveland, and Philadelphia, they've all come dangerously close. But last week, Detroit became the first major American city to teeter to the brink of bankruptcy and then fall off the edge. Now, the one-time industrial hub that was once the cradle of America's auto industry and the home to Motown's golden age of soul music filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy protection. Now, it's Detroit's only chance, city officials say, to pay off a staggering $18 billion in debts and then some. Now, not everyone is on board, however. Critics say bankruptcy was perhaps a little too rash and unnecessary. They include a Michigan judge who's seeking to block the move on the grounds that it violates the state's constitutional ban against cutting into pension benefits. Now, my guest today is Douglas Bernstein. Joins me from Detroit. He's a bankruptcy lawyer. Welcome to the show. I want to make clear to our viewers, Douglas, before we get underway, that you're not involved for the moment, for the time being, in this bankruptcy filing, and you're not representing any of the parties related to it. But obviously, as a bankruptcy lawyer, you know a lot more than I do about the issues involved. And you believe that this filing is absolutely vital to the city of Detroit. Not everyone agrees with you. Why do you think it's absolutely necessary?
Well, the biggest burden on the city is the pension obligations to the former city employees in the police and fire department. And under Michigan law, those pension obligations are constitutionally protected. However, in bankruptcy law, they are not. So the only way to accomplish a compromise of those obligations, which the city really cannot afford, is to file the bankruptcy.
My question being, this is obviously not the first time that an American city, this might be the biggest, has filed for bankruptcy. There have been other cities, and I named them at the beginning, that have come close to this type of situation, but they managed to avoid it. Why wasn't Detroit able, why did it come to this? Why weren't they able to save the day earlier?
Well, Detroit has avoided addressing the issue for decades. This is not a problem that was created overnight, and it won't be solved overnight. Really, it's been building up for tens of years, for decades. And a big part of the problem was the city of Detroit's infrastructure was built upon the assumption that it had 1.5 million people. And with the steady population decline, in part with the decline of the automobile industry, we're left now with a population of roughly 700,000 people, but the city never adjusted. So you've got a declining tax base, you've got industry leaving the city, and for a variety of reasons, nobody ever adjusted. And the city continuously tried borrowing their way out of their current financial issues without addressing them.
My question, though, is when you hear the word bankruptcy, everyone sort of goes running. If you're an investor, you're going to stand on the sidelines. If you're a business, you're not going to be inclined to perhaps move in. Is there a fear, as a bankruptcy lawyer, does bankruptcy tend to attach a stigma and it's very hard to bounce back afterwards?
For a bankruptcy lawyer, the actual filing has less of a stigma than it used to be. Maybe with the public, there's still a stigma attached. In reality, the city's been bankrupt for years, but they never went through the motions of actually filing the petition. The city just needed to get over the fact that it could not continue to borrow their way out and continue to spend money that it didn't have. This formalizes the process and gives the city the opportunity to implement a plan and work its way through and restructure itself.
And those who are overseeing the restructuring of Detroit, what they're basically saying is they want to spread the losses. They say this isn't just going to be the pensioners taking a hit. This will also be the creditors, the investors. How's it going to work? Could you explain to our viewers?
Well, the bankruptcy law in the United States spreads the pain out. So if you're similarly situated, the idea is no one class of creditor should feel more pain than anybody else. And they should share equally. And the pain is spread out. And it's supposed to be an equitable distribution. Nobody is going to walk away happy with the process. But the idea is to bring order rather than a variety of creditors trying to grab as much as they can at the expense of other creditors. So the idea is to bring some sense of order to the process.
With bankruptcy, we've had a lot of people, I guess, even outside the U.S. looking in and saying, well, this is a harbinger of what's to come in the U.S. You know, cities are losing money. There's been white flight from city centers to the suburbs of America. This is the shape of things to come. Do you agree with that?
There's some truth to that, and it's been a problem because the system has never changed. In Detroit, nobody wanted to address these issues before. Maybe other cities have more to show and maybe more to offer, and where the population decline and the flight of industry hasn't been as rapid as Detroit. I mean, part of Detroit's problem, in truth, was the city didn't diversify in that it was so dependent upon the automobile industry. When the industry declined, so did the city, and it didn't revitalize itself or diversify to bring in new kinds of industry to make up that gap.
And you would argue perhaps that it's not too late. I would mention perhaps a city like Pittsburgh, which had a similar sort of industrial base. The steel manufacturing industry had had a period of decline, and it's really managed to revitalize and seemingly bounce back.
Well, yeah, that's exactly the example. Pittsburgh's a perfect example of what Detroit can be. Detroit's not going to have 1.5 million people again, but maybe it'll stabilize at somewhere between 500 and 700,000 people and won't be so reliant upon the automobile industry. In fact, there's some development going on within the city that is very positive. And there are some good things going on. And if the city can get its financial house in order, then perhaps the process can move forward more quickly.
Douglas, a columnist, a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist with the New York Times newspaper, Paul Krugman, he wrote that Detroit is basically an innocent victim of market forces. He says its citizens had the bad luck of finding themselves working in the wrong place at the wrong time. Decline happens. Do you agree with that?
In part, yes. In part, no. Part of the problem with Detroit was there's been financial mismanagement within government for years. There's been corruption in government. All of this impacted the city and its workers. Now, part of the challenge you've got for the city workers, who deserve all kinds of sympathy for their plight because they weren't the highest paid to begin with. They devoted their career to working for the city under the understanding at the end of their career they would have this pension to fall back on. The one thing that they did not do is keep their eye on who was running their funds for them.
So there was some bad management there, perhaps. You've said in the past that Detroit residents
Right.
you've said that Detroit residents are heavily taxed for basically lousy public services. And I'm just wondering, aren't those services under bankruptcy protection about to become even lousier?
No, I wouldn't think so. In fact, under a bankruptcy plan, you may be able to reallocate resources. And I'll give you some examples of the inefficiencies in city services. 40% of the streetlights don't work. The police force, which is really taxed, I mean, the burden that put on the police force is immense given the crime rate in the city. There's 51 officers who do nothing but do payroll for the police department. They can be redeployed under a plan of adjustment to be more worthwhile and more of a service to the city. The city does not need to be in the business of picking up rubbish. They can outsource that. So you may find some more efficiencies without having the city in the business of providing all these things that they don't need to provide and provide them poorly.
How long does bankruptcy protection, as a general rule, from the time you file to the time you've worked out your debt payments, how long does it usually take?
Well, there's no rule of thumb. It depends on the size of the city, how complex the problems are, how much the creditors fight the reorganization plan, and in fact the eligibility for filing the petition itself. So basically it's been a 1 to 3 year process, but we haven't been faced with a city the size of Detroit having gone through the process. My suspicion is a 1 to 2 year process.
Well, remember, Douglas, you'll probably remember as well, I think it was back in the 70s, right? That famous headline in the New York Daily News, it was Gerald Ford, then president, to New York City, drop dead. He basically refused to bail out the city. Is there any question in your mind that a federal bailout would be a possibility for Detroit, or is that out of the question?
I think it's out of the question in the true sense of a bailout where the federal government comes in and really pays the debts. That would enable mismanagement. What might help, though, is if monies were made available for certain projects. I mean, there's tens of thousands of abandoned homes in the city, which are crime scenes. If the federal government came in and assisted in the funding of demolishing them, that would be a positive. If the federal government made loans available for providing new police cars and fire equipment, which they're ancient and they don't run. I mean, for example, just over the weekend, there was an emergency call to one of the city's emergency medical service teams, and after an hour, nobody showed up because a city the size of Detroit, which has a land area greater than Manhattan, there were only 7 units on duty at the time.
And Douglas, since we have run out of time, we're going to have to leave there. I will just add with that a slightly pessimistic note that I read somewhere, the average response time for police right now in the city of Detroit is 58 minutes versus a national average of 11 minutes. So I guess that gives a little view of the extent of the problem and the challenges ahead. I thank you very much for helping us work through some of these issues and understand better what's going on in Detroit. Douglas Bernstein, bankruptcy lawyer based in the Detroit region. Thanks for being our guest today here on The Interview on France 24. Thanks to all of you for watching.